The morphine was wearing off when Greta opened her eyes. The ceiling tiles were white the way hospital ceilings always were, indistinguishable, institutional, the kind of surface you study only when you have nothing else to look at. A monitor beeped somewhere to her left. Her throat felt scraped raw. She tried to swallow and couldn't. The room was empty. No coat was draped over the armrest of the visitor's chair. No half-finished cup of coffee on the bedside table. No jacket over the back of a chair. No sign that anyone had sat in that chair during the 7 hours she'd been under. The surgical team had removed a ruptured appendix and spent the next 4 hours managing the infection that had already begun spreading by the time she'd reached the ER. Her surgeon would tell her later, when he came by for the afternoon check, that she was lucky they caught it when they did. Another 12 hours, and the story would have been different. At that same moment, 800 miles away in Scottsdale, Arizona, Wade was finishing his 3rd round of golf in 2 days. He had sunglasses on and a cold beer in his hand, and his college roommates were giving him a hard time about a chip shot he'd flubbed on the 14th hole. He laughed. His phone was in his back pocket. He had seen the missed calls, 3 from Greta, 1 from an unfamiliar number, and told himself he'd call back after dinner. Greta stared at the ceiling until a nurse came in to check her vitals. "Good morning," the nurse said, adjusting the IV line. "You're back with us." Greta tried her voice. It came out rough. "How long was I in surgery?" "About 7 hours. The nurse made a note on her chart. "You've got a strong heart. That counts for a lot." "Was anyone?" Greta stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "Was anyone here while I was under?" The nurse looked at her in that careful way medical professionals learn early. When to answer and when to redirect. "Someone from the waiting room asked about you around 2. Let me check if she's still here." Rowena was still there. She'd been in the waiting room for 6 hours, with a magazine she'd never opened, and a cup of vending machine coffee gone cold beside her. The moment the nurse came through the double doors, she was already on her feet. She walked into the room and took one look at Greta, the pale skin, the IV line, the way Greta's eyes found hers with something too exhausted to be relief, and pulled the visitor's chair directly to the bedside without saying a single word about Wade. "I called you the second the ambulance reached the hospital," Greta said. "I know, I came straight here." Rowena sat down. "Stuart has Ezra, don't worry about anything." Greta looked at the ceiling again. Wade didn't come. It wasn't a question. Rowena didn't answer it like one. She reached over and covered Greta's hand with hers. "He called back," Greta said. Her voice didn't break. It was flat and quiet, like the surface of something that had already gone still. 3 hours after I came out of surgery. He called back and said he was sorry he missed it, and that he'd catch the first flight out in the morning. She had needed emergency surgery. She had been in septic shock. She had nearly died on that table, and her husband had seen the missed calls and put his phone back in his pocket and finished his round. Rowena held her hand and didn't say anything. Sometimes there wasn't anything to say. Wade arrived the next morning, carrying a plastic bag from the hospital gift shop, flowers wrapped in cellophane, and a box of chocolates with a ribbon. He had the look of a man who knew he'd made a mistake and was hoping the gesture might take care of most of it. Greta watched him come in. She had been awake since 5, watching the morning light shift across the window. Ezra's photograph was on the bedside table. She'd been looking at it more than she'd slept. Wade set the flowers near the edge of the table. "You look better than I expected." "The doctor says I'll be discharged in 2 days," Greta said. "Good. That's good." He sat down and laced his hands in his lap. "Greta, I'm really sorry. I should have been on the first flight the minute I saw those calls. I know that." "You knew I wasn't feeling well before you left." "I know. I called you 3 times." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought you'd be fine. You always handle things." Greta looked at Ezra's photograph for a long moment. Then she looked back at her husband. "I almost didn't make it off the table, Wade." He stared at her. "The surgeon told me this morning. If Rowena hadn't followed the ambulance, if she hadn't been there to give consent when my blood pressure dropped and they couldn't reach next of kin, they would have had to wait, and I would have been in a lot more danger." She kept her voice level. "She was there because she was listed as my emergency contact. You stopped answering your phone." Wade didn't speak for a long stretch. The flowers sat between them, still wrapped in cellophane. "Come home when you discharge," he said finally. "We'll work through this." Greta looked at the window. "I'm going to Rowena's." Rowena's house sat in a neighborhood where the streets had sidewalks and old oaks that had been there longer than the houses under them. By the time they pulled into the driveway on discharge day, Ezra had spotted the car through the front window and was already pressed against the glass with both palms flat. Rowena's husband, Stuart, held the door open and kept one hand on Ezra's shoulder so the toddler didn't barrel into Greta before she was ready. "Easy, bud. Mama needs a gentle welcome today." Ezra accepted this instruction for approximately 2 seconds before wrapping both arms around Greta's knees and pressing his face into her leg. She bent down slowly. The incision was still sore, and held him. "Hi, baby," she said into his hair. The guest room had been made up. Fresh sheets, a nightlight. Stuart had moved in from the hallway, a small basket of things Rowena had picked up for Ezra. Nothing in it cost much. But every corner of the room said the same thing. Someone had thought about what they'd need. Wade came by the following afternoon. He sat across from Greta in Rowena's living room with his hands laced together, and told her he understood why she was upset, told her he was going to be different, told her that one mistake shouldn't undo 6 years. He said all the right words in a sequence that sounded rehearsed on the drive over. Greta waited for him to finish. Then she said, "I want a divorce." He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. "Greta, I've been carrying this marriage for 2 years," she said. "The hospital was just when I finally understood that you were never going to show up. Not when it mattered. One mistake. Wade." Her voice stayed quiet and even. "You watched your phone ring and put it back in your pocket. You made a choice. I'm making one now too." He tried again. He came back 3 more times over the following weeks, once with a card, once with a real florist's arrangement, once with a long text message that read like something composed at 2 in the morning. Greta read each one. She replied to the text. She thanked him for the card. She didn't change her answer. His mother came to Rowena's house one afternoon, with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and told Greta that no marriage was perfect, that Ezra needed his father in the home, that decisions made in anger rarely held up. "Ezra has his father," Greta said calmly. "Wade and I have agreed on that. He's going to be in Ezra's life. That's not changing." She looked at her mother-in-law without blinking. "What's changing is that I won't be his wife anymore." Wade's mother had come in expecting a negotiation. The look on Greta's face told her she was in the wrong room for it. She left, and Greta walked back to the kitchen where Ezra was building something out of Duplo blocks on the tile floor, and she sat down beside him and handed him a yellow piece, and felt, for the first time in weeks, like she could actually breathe. Stuart had been dealing with 2 herniated discs from a workplace injury the previous spring, and the physical therapist who came to the house twice a week was named Dominic. He was tall, soft-spoken, methodical. He carried a worn canvas bag and always knocked exactly twice before stepping inside. He'd been coming for 6 weeks by the time Greta was settled into the guest room. They crossed paths in the hallway. He said good morning. She said good morning. She poured coffee and he accepted a cup with both hands. She noticed that, and said thank you and meant it. She noticed other things as the weeks went on. The way he listened to Stuart without interrupting, even when Stuart complained about the harder exercises. The afternoon he spotted a stripped cabinet hinge in the kitchen and fixed it quietly with a screwdriver from his bag before anyone mentioned it. The time Ezra wandered in during a session and Dominic, without breaking stride on the movement he was walking Stuart through, simply shifted a resistance band out of the toddler's path so he wouldn't trip on it. None of it was performed. Nothing was done for an audience. That was the part that stayed with her. One Wednesday she came home earlier than usual to find the session already over. Dominic and Stuart still talking on the back porch. Stuart with a beer, Dominic with a glass of water, both of them in the middle of what sounded like a heated but cheerful argument about college football. Dominic laughed at something Stuart said, and it was just a laugh, nothing calculated in it. Greta put her bag down and stood in the kitchen for a moment without going outside. She wasn't ready to name what she was thinking, she knew that. But she also knew she hadn't stood somewhere and simply noticed a moment in a very long time. She poured herself a glass of water and went out to the porch. The afternoon light had gone gold. Stuart was retelling a story involving a bad call in a bowl game 4 years back. Dominic shifted over on the step without being asked, making room, and Greta sat down, and the story continued, and nobody made a thing of it. A few weeks later, he stopped by on a Thursday when there was no appointment, dropping off exercise notes for Stuart, he said. Rowena invited him to stay for dinner. He accepted without making it into anything, which Greta had started to notice was his way: comfortable without being imposing, present without being loud about it. He sat across from her at the table and asked what she did at the hospital. She told him, scheduling and operations, running logistics across 3 departments. He asked a question that proved he'd actually been listening, which was rarer than it should have been. She answered. He asked another one. Ezra was in his high chair through all of this, working very seriously on a bowl of peas, one at a time, with the focus of a surgeon. At some point he looked up, studied Dominic, then held a single pea out across the table in his fist. Rowena pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Dominic looked at the pea. He looked at Ezra. He accepted it with complete seriousness, as if it were something of genuine value. "Thank you," he said. Ezra, satisfied, returned to his bowl. Spring moved into summer. Stuart finished his physical therapy and the appointments stopped. The Thursday dinners didn't. Dominic would text ahead and ask what he could bring. He always showed up with something useful: bread from the good bakery, a dessert Ezra could eat, or once, a specific brand of sparkling water Rowena had mentioned offhand 3 weeks earlier that she could never find at her regular store. He'd driven out of his way for it. "You remembered that?" Rowena said. Dominic seemed genuinely puzzled that this required a response. Greta watched the exchange from the doorway and didn't say anything. One Saturday morning in July, she and Ezra ran into Dominic at the farmer's market. Ezra spotted him first and broke into a sprint across the grass with complete conviction, which told Greta something she'd already half known. Dominic crouched down, asked him very seriously about the strawberries, and listened to Ezra's opinion with the attention of someone receiving expert testimony. They walked through the market together for an hour. It was ordinary in every way. Crowded stalls, warm morning, the smell of coffee from a cart near the entrance. Dominic bought a jar of local honey and let Ezra choose which one. He noticed when the strap on Greta's bag started slipping down her shoulder and adjusted it without calling attention to the fact that he'd done it. When they reached the parking lot, he said, "I really like spending time with you." He said it the way a person says something they've been carrying for a while, and finally just sat down. Greta buckled Ezra into his car seat before she answered. Then she stood at the open door, with the morning sun cutting across the asphalt. "I'm still figuring out what's next for me," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know." He leaned against the side of his truck. "I'm not asking you to have it figured out. I'm just saying I'd like to keep showing up if you're okay with it." She looked at Ezra, who had located a cracker from the snack bag and was managing his life very competently. She looked back at Dominic. "I'm okay with it," she said. It didn't begin any single way. It began in accumulations. A text saying he'd seen something that made him think of her. An evening at the park where Ezra refused to leave the swings, and Dominic held him steady on the slide without counting how many times they went around. A Tuesday when she came home exhausted from a long shift, and Rowena said Dominic had dropped off soup, not for any occasion, just because he'd made too much. And it was still warm on the stove. Wade kept his scheduled visits, and Greta was steady and consistent through all of them, because Ezra needed that from both his parents. One Saturday, Wade parked in front of Rowena's house and sat for a moment when he saw Dominic's truck at the curb. He came inside. He watched Dominic cross-legged on the living room floor, rolling a ball back and forth with Ezra. He watched the easy, familiar way Ezra said the name. He watched Greta in the kitchen talking to Rowena with a kind of ease he hadn't seen on her face in years. When Wade left that afternoon, he sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. He thought about the hospital room. He thought about the cellophane flowers. He thought about her voice saying, "I almost didn't make it off the table," and the fact that his instinct that afternoon in Scottsdale had been to put the phone back in his pocket and finish his round. He drove away without looking at the house. Greta's hospital promoted her in October. Regional operations manager, a role she'd applied for before any of this started. The first month was longer hours and a steeper learning curve than she'd expected, and then it became the job, and the job became something she was genuinely good at, and knowing that, really knowing it, feeling it settle, was something she had missed without realizing exactly how much. Rowena set the table for 5 on the Friday after the promotion. Dominic arrived with wine and let Ezra carry it to the table, which required maximum concentration and very careful walking. He handed it to Stuart with the gravity of a completed mission. "Good work," Dominic said seriously. Ezra grinned, his whole face grin. After dinner, when Stuart had done the dishes and Rowena had wrapped the leftovers, and Ezra had fallen asleep between two couch cushions, like a small collapsed thing. Greta and Dominic stood on the front porch in the October dark. The neighbors had already started putting decorations up. The air smelled like it was getting ready to turn cold. "I want to say something," Dominic said. His hands were in his jacket pockets. "And I want to say it right." Greta waited. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I'm better at just being around, showing up. I know that's not very poetic." She said, "It's actually what I like best." He looked at her directly. "I want to keep doing this, whatever this is. I want to keep being part of it." He paused. "You and Ezra, you've been the best part of my week for months now. I'd like to stop pretending that's casual." The porch light was warm and the street was quiet. Through the front window, she could see Rowena tucking a blanket around Ezra on the couch, folding the edge in carefully around his feet. "I'd like that too," Greta said. She reached over and took his hand. He didn't say anything else. He just stood beside her and looked out at the street, and that was enough. It was more than enough. December came in with cold mornings and Ezra's insistence on wearing his dinosaur rain boots, regardless of the actual weather. He had developed strong opinions about footwear and showed no signs of reconsidering them. One Sunday evening, they were all in the backyard. Stuart at the grill, Rowena carrying dishes from the kitchen, Ezra chasing a soccer ball that was slightly too large for him across the yard. Dominic jogged beside him with exaggerated, stumbling effort, letting the toddler pull ahead every time Ezra scored, or decided he had, which amounted to the same thing, and threw both hands into the air. "Did you see?" he shouted, and then before anyone could answer, he turned and looked up. "Did you see, Dom?" Dominic raised both hands in surrender. "I saw the whole thing. Nobody could have stopped that." Ezra grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward the other end of the yard. "Again." "Again," Dominic agreed. Greta stood on the back steps and watched them go. She thought about the hospital room. The empty chair, the ceiling tiles, the monitor beeping, and no one's coat on the armrest. She had lain there understanding something she hadn't been ready to put into words yet. That the person who was supposed to be there had made a choice. And that choice had shown her something she couldn't unsee. She didn't carry that memory as a wound anymore. She carried it as information. It had told her what she needed. It had shown her the door. The evening light was going low and gold across the grass. The smell of the grill drifted over from where Stuart stood arguing pleasantly with Rowena about what constituted adequate marinating time. Ezra's laughter came back across the yard. She had built this. Not alone, never entirely alone, but she had been the one who said it clearly and didn't take it back. She had been the one who stayed in the fight, not with a failing marriage but with herself, with the version of her life that was still possible if she was willing to walk toward it. That part was hers. Ezra looked back over his shoulder and found her on the steps. "Mama, watch!" She straightened. "I'm watching." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the game. Dominic glanced at her over the top of Ezra's head, just for a second, and smiled. She smiled back and stepped off the steps and into the yard to join them, and the door to everything that came before swung quietly shut behind her.